It can be tempting because of how powerful batch Apex jobs are to write lots of them for a Salesforce org. And one could argue that it keeps heavyweight processing out of Apex triggers sometimes, and that's good, right? Not exactly. Writing lots of batch Apex when you don't need to is usually a really bad idea. When it comes to considering batch Apex, it's usually just not necessary. The reason is that most of everything we do has some kind of criteria tied to it. We don't normally just start going into records and altering their field values for no reason. When a record creates a condition for an update, its state changes, and it's these state changes that Apex code is meant to respond to. Changed state can be an event that leads to asynchronous Apex, but it usually shouldn't lead to batch Apex. In other words, we have asynchronous Apex that's appropriate for being enqueued and executing on demand around the occurrence of certain events or criteria. Batch Apex isn't one of those tools in the toolkit for such a purpose. What is it for then? Well, when it isn't clear that state has changed across an object, that's usually when batch Apex is needed. In other words, we're concerned with state across the entire org, perhaps across an entire object within the org, or across a large subset of records, looking at that group of records as an entity that holds a state of its own, in aggregate. What do I mean? Aggregations. You won't necessarily get a sum, an average, a median, or other forms of summarization from large subsets of records without the ability to examine them in bulk. But again, you've got to be careful because sometimes it's possible to perform aggregations without batch Apex. Since queuable jobs can be chained, for example, then there are some instances in which aggregations could be performed using that method. But again, it comes down to when does this aggregation happen? If there is no clear criteria that kicks it off other than an on-demand request from the user or running on a schedule, then maybe batch Apex is a good fit. Large data volumes. I mean, like really large data volumes where there are hundreds of thousands or millions of records. In those instances, batch Apex can be a good way to go. Hopefully, your org doesn't have too many of these requirements where it is necessary to loop over giant record sets like this. Expensive scans, too, where maybe you're trying to identify very obscure criteria that may exist within record clusters or exist somehow across the entire object. Remember, most of the time, if you're just looking for values that match on a few records, then a SOQL query will work for that just fine. On the other hand, if you're trying to identify something more abstract, like properties of record groups that exist across the org, or large record sets that hold certain properties when taken together in aggregate, and identifying those properties is difficult, then batch Apex can make sense. What you may notice in my describing all of these is that these are complex, sophisticated use cases. You'll encounter them rarely, and therefore you ought to use batch Apex sparingly. At the time of this course's recording, you're only allowed to have 5 simultaneously running or enqueued batch Apex jobs anyway. That may change with time, of course, so always refer back to the Salesforce documentation. But my point there is, you only have a handful of these powerful jobs that can run at any one time anyway. Learn to use your on-demand Apex anywhere possible, and save batch Apex for being the ultimate powerful option when dealing with giant datasets.